Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to another episode of Suhoor Bites, where we take a few moments each morning to reflect on the wisdom of the Qur'an. In these blessed moments before dawn, as we nourish our bodies for the day of fasting ahead, let us also feed our souls with the light of divine guidance. Each day we will reflect on the verse from the Qur'an, drawing inspiration and lessons to carry with us throughout the day. Today we will be looking at Surah Al-Rum, verse 9. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. أولم يسيروا في الأرض فينظروا كيف كان عاقبة الذين من قبلهم كانوا أشد منهم قوة وأثاروا الأرض وعمروها أكثر مما عمروها وجاءتهم رسلهم بالبينات فما كان الله ليظلمهم ولكن كانوا أنفسهم يظلمون. Have they not travelled in the land and seen how was the fate of those who were before them? They were more powerful than them, and they ploughed the earth and developed it more than they have developed it. Their apostles brought them manifest proofs. So it was not Allah who wronged them, but it was they who used to wrong themselves. To fully appreciate this verse, we need to understand the context in which it was revealed. The early Muslims in Mecca lived among powerful tribes and were aware of stories about grand kingdoms of the past, people who seemed invincible during their heyday, yet eventually fell into ruin. The Qur'an takes these real-world examples and turns them into a lesson for every generation. Look at these once mighty societies. They had great strength, remarkable engineering, and thriving commerce, but all of that failed them when they cast aside the moral and spiritual principles that they had been presented with. Tafsir al-Mizan alludes to the concept of Sunnatullah, divine custom. In other words, Allah's modus operandum, and in this case it refers to the modus operandum with respect to the rise and fall of civilizations. These civilizations can't blame fate or claim they were unjustly singled out. Instead, they actively sowed the seeds of their own downfall by neglecting truth and moral responsibility. The verse ends with, Allah would never have wronged them, but they were wronging themselves, emphasizing that divine justice remains steadfast. It's the arrogance and spiritual deafness of people that ultimately bring destruction. In Tafsir al-Nur, Shaykh Mohsin Qaraati draws a parallel between the material progress of these past nations and modern societies. He notes that while cultivating land and constructing cities can be praiseworthy acts to provide shelter, livelihoods, and cultural growth, none of it stands on stable ground if a society abandons the ethical framework offered by the prophets. Overconfidence and complacency creep in, and communities that pride themselves on worldly achievements begin to ignore the very moral compass that could sustain them. In simple terms, the moment we prioritize our technological and economic accomplishments over spiritual integrity, we risk the same fate as those who came before. This message is echoed in another verse of Surah Al-Rum, verse 42, where Allah again says, قُلْ سِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَيَنْظُرُوا كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةُ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِ. Travel over the land and see how was the fate of those who were before you. We are being instructed to travel and observe what transpired with older civilizations whose main mistake was placing something other than Allah as the objective of their life. Allama Tabatabai says this is more than a literal call to travel abroad. He views it as a metaphor for opening our eyes and hearts to the lessons of history. Of course, we can literally visit the ruins of past empires or flip through the pages of history books, but the point is to think deeply about how these societies detach themselves from divine guidance. Technological and economic progress accelerate every day, yet that doesn't necessarily translate into moral or spiritual growth. We might attend conferences celebrating innovations in science and industry, or watch news stories about record-breaking projects and powerful economies, none of which is inherently bad. However, the Qur'an taps us on the shoulder, urging us not to let external development overshadow the ethics and reverence that keep a society healthy from within. What's even more humbling is the reminder that Allah sent messengers with clear evidences to these ancient peoples. They weren't left without guidance. The downfall they experienced wasn't due to a lack of information, but a willful blindness. It's the same potential blindness we risk today if we block out the moral and spiritual principles that the Qur'an and the prophetic teachings continually set before us. Divine intervention doesn't forcibly reshape our communities. Rather, we choose whether to engage with that guidance or brush it aside as inconvenient or outdated. The phrase, "have they not travelled through the land?" challenges us to see the world as a living classroom. Every ruin or artifact, every anecdote from antiquity, is an invitation to reflect on why even the grandest empires ultimately crumble. Maybe it was an appetite for endless expansion, the dehumanization of certain groups, or simply forgetting the accountability we all owe to our Creator. The Qur'an insists that by learning about their mistakes, we can protect ourselves from repeating them. At the end of the day, the central point in Surah Rum verse 9 is about striking a balance. Progress in worldly matters is valuable, but it must be guided by spiritual consciousness. When a society loses sight of that balance, it begins to slide toward injustice and moral decay, laying the groundwork for its downfall. If we only measure success by GDP or tall skyscrapers, without giving thought to how just, compassionate, or God-aware we are essentially repeating history's most frequent mistake. So the next time we read history or travel to new destinations and explore new cultures, use it as a time to pause and ask, what can I learn from this place? Is there a moral lesson I can incorporate into my life? By pondering on these questions, we will be acting on the advice of the Qur'an and inshallah protect ourselves from prioritizing other things over Allah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أولم يتفكروا في أنفسهم ما خلق الله السماوات والأرض وما بينهما إلا بالحق وأجل مسمى وَإِنَّ كَثِيرًا مِنَ النَّاسِ بِلِقَاءِ رَبِّهِمْ لَكَافِرُونَ أَوَلَمْ يَسِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَيَنظُرُوا كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةُ الَّذِينَ مِن قَبْلِهِمْ كَانُوا أَشَدَّ مِنْهُمْ قُوَّةً وَأَثَارُوا الْأَرْضَ وَعَمَرُوهَا أَكْثَرَ مِمَّا عَمَرُوهَا وَجَاءَتْهُمْ رُسُلُهُم بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ فَمَا كَانَ اللَّهُ لِيَظْلِمَهُمْ وَلَكِن كَانُوا